All right, everyone. Welcome again to the CMMC 2.0 webinar on what CMMC 2.0 means for you. My name is Karen Vasquez. I'm with C3 Integrated Solutions. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started. We're joined today by Bill Wootton with C3 Integrated Solutions and Christina Reynolds with BDO. So let's get started. We have with us today, as I mentioned, Bill Wootton. He's the president of C3 Integrated Solutions. He's also a co-founder. C3 is a full-service IT provider specializing in securing our nation's defense industrial base. We are also joined by Christina Reynolds. She's the director of industry specialty services with BDO. She is a CMMC registered provider with 22 years of specialization in cybersecurity and information assurance policy. So I will turn this over to them in just a second. We're going to start, however, with our very first poll question. So if Renee, if you could tee up that question. The first one is, excuse me, sorry. Have you entered a self-assessment score in SPRS? Select one, please. Yes, no, what's SPRS? And then lastly, I need help calculating my score. So we'll give you guys a few seconds to answer that first polling question. Okay. So we have about 60% of you, about 2/3 yes, about 1/3 no, just a few folks that aren't sure exactly what that is. Okay. So as we get started here, we're going to do just a quick overview of what's changed about CMMC 2.0, level set, and then really get into the meat of the discussion. So I will tee this up to Bill, and he's going to give you a quick update on what's changed.
Thanks, Karen. It's good to see so many people have already put their scores in the SPRS. That shows that people have taken CMMC 1.0 somewhat seriously. They took the Clause 7019 seriously, and that they're doing at least some of the work to be able to get those scores in, to be able to check that box and get things going. Now, we're just going to do a couple of minutes to kind of get everyone level set about what CMMC 2.0 is all about. About a month ago, the DoD came out at the end of their review with CMMC 2.0, and it had a lot of significant changes in it. As you can see on the slide here, there was a handful of things that are really a fairly big impact to contractors. The elimination of levels 2 and 4, the elimination of the maturity requirements from a CMMC standpoint, as well as the elimination of the unique CMMC practices, those that went above and beyond the NIST standards. Also in CMMC 2.0, we kind of came back to the idea of self-assessments. All of level 1 can now go through a self-assessment, and a fairly good amount of level 2, the original level 3, now called level 2, contractors will be able to self-assess as well. Now, the twist on this is that those self-assessments must be attested by a corporate officer of the organization on an annual basis. So someone's actually got to sign their name to that attestation. That puts a little bit of teeth into it. Third-party assessments will still be occurring for prioritized assessments within that new level 2 layer, and we'll dive into that in a little bit as well. Two other big changes in CMMC 2.0 are limited time-bound POAMs and limited waivers, which we'll talk about those a little bit later on as well. So if we go to the next slide, we can see graphically kind of how this looks. And this is a graphic that has been the CMMC 2.0 organization put out. I think it does a great job of kind of showing on the left side what the 1.0 model looked like, and then kind of really illustrating on 2.0 the fact that level 1 is still those same 17 practices that were in the FAR for FCI, and level 2 really now is focused around NIST 800-171, and that's kind of always been the core of CMMC, but now it really is, that's what level 2 is all about. And level 3 is still kind of somewhat put on a parking lot. They're going to get to that a little later on. We know that's going to be focused around 172. So as we slide to this next slide, Christina, I want to let you kind of take that one over, because that one really drives into the conversation around assessments and how that's going to work.
Right. So what they have done in changing to this new Model 2.0 is, I think more or less the DoD evaluated over 800 comments from industry and really felt the pain points of, especially the small businesses that find CMMC onerous, resource intensive, and very time consuming to implement. But also furthermore, pursuit of certification really wasn't totally required across the board for all contractors. They really wanted to say, we've got a current bottleneck in the C3PAOs. There's 300,000 DIB contractors. How do we squeeze those through that bottleneck of the 5 C3PAOs that are currently in the market? We've got a bunch of provisional, but there's only 5 full C3PAOs currently in the market. So I think this was a really good suggestion by the DoD to start with, which was to bifurcate what was level 3 certification requirements into 2 levels. And so you'll see with the green arrows, those are all being routed through the self-attestation. We're using that SPRS database, which is hosted by the PIEE database, so that Procurement Integrated Environment database, which links all into SAM. So everything's kind of all linked together. When you go in, the SPRS database sits underneath the PIEE, and you self-attest that score yearly. And so that means, and I would recommend, if you're self-attesting your score and it's not 110, you need to be working on that score to get it to the point that it's 110. And please note, if you have not done your scoring or somebody else did it for you, there are special scoring requirements to use for this. Some of the controls, if you haven't implemented them, would be -5 points. Some, if you haven't implemented them, would be -3, and the rest would be -1. So it's kind of like a risk assessment based scoring mechanism. So please make sure you scored it correctly. There's a lot of implications down the road if you didn't. But here's the big change, that bifurcation of level 2 now, where some contractors who are critical to national security will be deemed prioritized acquisitions. And those will still need to achieve certification. Those with non-prioritized acquisitions, those not related or mission critical to national security, will be allowed, at least in the near term. We don't know what this implication is for the far term, but at least in the near term, to relieve that pressure on the C3PAOs, we see them being allowed to continue to self-attest like we do for DFAR 7012 and post their score on SPRS. And the level 3, level 2 certification requirements, you see that instead of SPRS as the database, CMMC Model 2 is introducing a new database to some of you called EMAS, that's used internally in the government to kind of warehouse your whole compliance package, so that somebody on the back end, presumably your contracts officer, maybe an AO, maybe your C3PAO, is going to be able to review that package in its entirety, because it's going to be held in that database. So that'll include elements like your policies and procedures, your system security plan, and your POAM. So those are all going to be the critical items that you want to see, making sure that you meet all 15 families, because with the reduction in the controls, we're going to see a small reduction in the number of families that you have to write policies to. So as you look at this, when you go get certification for EMAS, that'll be every 3 years. So we're going to see kind of a renewal of that package every 3 years. And furthermore, for that certification posted in EMAS, it will download, as they say, automatically into SPRS. I don't know if that mechanism's set up yet. We don't even have EMAS set up yet, but that is the future plan for how we're bifurcating, how 2 different types of contractors can either go the green arrow, self-attestation, post to SPRS, or if the requirement is pulled down in your contract, so you might see that in the solicitation, you might see that in the RFI, is what they've told us. Then once you're notified and it's either in one of those 2 things or in your final contract, then you're going to see the certification requirement.
Great. Okay, thank you both. Well, let's get into some questions now. So our first question is, Can you talk a little bit about sort of the impact of these changes?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll take that to lead off on. I think this is in a lot of ways a big win for those smaller contractors, especially those that were really struggling. Christina, you just mentioned the challenge of being able to meet some of those requirements from an assessment standpoint. I think the maturity levels and the maturity requirements in particular, a lot of clients were really struggling with, not just necessarily to deploy stuff, that part's relatively straightforward, but then to go ahead and prove that maturity and really understanding even what that meant and what was that bar going to be. I do think that the limited POAMs, depending on how that rolls out, also becomes a really good impact for things. There was a lot of pressure before with CMMC to be 100 out of 100, perfect score, pass, fail, no. Now they've kind of come out and said, well, some things are going to be critical, you know, non-negotiable, but there are some things that will give you a little bit of a window and a very strict time-bound POAM to be able to go clean that stuff up and still be able to move forward with the acquisition. I think those are a couple of the biggest things. You know, Christina, what's your take on it?
Yeah, so what, coming out of the DoD myself and being an ISO for the DoD, what I find is not at all surprising. So this is the way the DoD does it. And what we see with CMM 2.0 is that they have taken ownership of this. And it is starting to look more and more like what we do internal to the DoD, which is the risk management framework. And one of the things we know, number one, is POAM items are allowed within the risk management framework. We certify any given network inside the federal government. They acknowledge that there may be POAM items open because it acknowledges that in a system development lifecycle, you add new servers, you add new endpoints, your network is constantly changing, your systems are constantly changing, you add new software and they're constantly changing. So what that really is you're constantly opening up new vulnerabilities, new POAM items that you're constantly in this process of remediating, mitigating, and you're just kind of cyclically doing this. I think the acknowledgement of that is healthy within a system development lifecycle. And what it does is it really aligns with the DoD model internal to the DoD, where we would have 3 different levels for kind of MAC categories of the highest risk vulnerability, moderate, and then a low risk. And what the DoD would say internal to those packages is, okay, you can't have any MAC ones. Those were the highest risk. You have to close 100% of those out. That's similar to what they're saying now is they're going to designate a small subset of those controls that you cannot have open. Those are going to be the highest risk if you leave them open. So, you look for things, and a great way to kind of start to figure out which ones they're going to say you can't have open are, look at the SPRS scoring. The ones that they rate the highest vulnerability, the -5s, close those out first. And the rest, the -3s and the -1s, they would align to the moderate to low risk categories. Those are more than likely going to be the ones that they'll probably give you some wiggle room, let the POAM stay open. And I think too, this alignment and recognizing that we don't have to have a maturity. The real intent was that you could develop your policies and procedures, but implement them over the past year, the past 2 years, the past 5 years, and show them how mature your practice was. Well, the God's honest truth is that nobody's mature in their practices. I think so many of these controls are so new to the DIB, and especially small businesses who are hurting from this, trying to figure out how to easily implement those controls. So the DoD said, hey, let's lay off how mature their practice is. Do they have these controls in place? Even if it was put into place 2 weeks ago, we're gonna relax on the maturity. That I'm sure will come later. Right now, let's get to implementing those controls fully.
Yeah, I think those are great insights there. I think a couple pieces there to really take away are a certain recognition that there is continual improvement, continual change, and a continual evolving of what you're doing to secure your environment. And then that second piece is kind of almost implicitly saying, look, we recognize not everyone was at the finish line yet. Everyone, we hate saying it, but a lot of folks are not where they should be. It's going to take a process and some time. Let's get folks as far down the path as we can, as quickly as we can, and then there's always room to improve the standards. So great points there. Karen, what's next?
All right, we got the next question. Oh, excuse me. So we talked about what has changed. Let's talk a little bit about what hasn't changed.
There we go. Christina, you want to take lead on that, or?
Sure, sure. And you can roll to the next slide because you know how I like my visuals. So I think the next slide really showcases kind of where we are and where we're going and how that's not really going to change a whole lot for you. So the onus here is that road that you're on to meet your current contract compliance for DFAR 7012. Well, the good news is none of that's going to change if you interpret that as good news. I'm sure many of you were like, could we have just cranked back those controls? But there's good news in all of this as well. So some of the answers that they've provided in their frequently asked questions really give us more clarity. So for example, will prime contractors and subcontractors be required to hold the same CMMC level? Essentially, the answer was if they are both processing FCI and CUI data, then yes. If the prime contractor is processing FCI and CUI, but the subcontractor is only processing limited amounts of data or only FCI, then they could actually be holding a lower level. So what we will see is the contract itself may come down and say, okay, the sub is only responsible for a CMMC level 1, which aligns to what you should be already doing for your basic cyber hygiene, that FAR 52-204-21. Now, it's a minimum 17 security controls, easily implementable. These are barely, that baseline that you should be doing minimally, but you cannot go below if you're doing business with the federal government. And these requirements are not only within the DFARS clause, but they're looking to pull this up into an overarching federal FAR clause as well. So be on the lookout that these NIST 800-171 controls, they're in your contracts now. They will be in CMMC as they're presented in DFARS, but also look for them to be expanding in the future. So take this as a note to what you're doing now, stay on that road, get to 110. Know where the other controls need to be pulled in. We show on this diagram these things called NFO controls. When you read the entirety of the NIST 800-171 requirements, buried in the appendix, and I hate to say it, it's buried in the appendix, but they say you must start with the NFO controls first. They're to be satisfied without specification. So make sure you're performing that due diligence, because what it's doing is just aligning these CMMC requirements back down to what's in your contracts now. So the good news is nothing's going to change or become more complicated. It's going to stay as is.
Yeah, I think there's you got some great things on the slide here. Also, I just want to reinforce, first and foremost, NIST 800-171 is still kind of the North Star. It's still the foundation that we're building everything around. Whatever you were doing before in terms of deploying or getting ready or meeting NIST 800-171, all of that is now central to where CMMC 2.0 is going. The other important thing to talk about a little bit is some of those other requirements that are not directly CMMC, things like DFAR 7012, still very much alive, clauses C through G, still very much alive, and anything that is beyond CMMC as well. Things like the data sovereignty requirements around ITAR, nuclear, no foreign data. Those things are all very much in place. Nothing has changed there, and everything you needed to do 2 months ago to do that, you still need to do today.
All right, time for our next polling question. What is the biggest positive change in CMMC 2.0? Eliminating levels 2 and 4, eliminating maturity requirements, eliminating CMMC unique practices, self-assessments, or allowing open POAM items? Great. Thank you, guys. Bill and Christina, you want to talk about those results a little bit?
Yeah, I'll kind of take a lead here, Bill. I think it's kind of surprising to me how many people answered number 1, eliminating levels 2 and 4. I think from my take on that, because levels 2 and 4 weren't certifiable just as a side note. And so it was actually made a lot of sense for the DoD to pull those back, because there was nothing we could really do with 2 and 4. It was more of a halfway point. So I think, as we move forward, I think this was a very healthy decision made by the DoD.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm a little surprised that number is as high. I certainly expected the self-assessments and the POAMs to rate up there pretty high. The self-assessments, I think, those of us that deal with this stuff every day are still a little bit nervous as to, are, is that we're going to slide backward a little bit on those self-assessments, but I could certainly see having a little bit of relief, especially in the short term, and things that are not, mission critical type acquisitions being a good thing as we move forward.
And I really hope that stays, because I think that's going to make a lot of small businesses take a deep sigh of relief.
I would agree as well, no doubt about it. That challenge of trying to get into that third-party assessment and a lot of the not knowing what you were getting into, we certainly heard from a lot of folks that was causing a lot of stress and strain.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move to our next question. Let's see here. Sorry, that's me. All right. How do you both think that this should change a contractor strategy?
I've already lost track, Christina. Is this yours or mine to lead?
Why don't you take the lead and I'll add
All
to
right.
it.
Not a problem. So, we're a technology-focused organization. Christina, you're the other half. You have much more of a compliance perspective on the world. From our perspective, and what we've talked to our clients about is, and from a technology standpoint, really doesn't change a lot. As we just mentioned, NIST 800-171 is still there. 110 of those 130 things you were supposed to do, 2 months ago, you still need to do for NIST 800-171. You should have been doing for DFAR 7012. So they're all there from a technology standpoint. And if you look real hard at the other 20, a lot of those kind of were implied in NIST 800-171 as well. So what we've been talking to folks is you've got a little bit of relief. It's going to be a little bit easier to hit that threshold, but still keep doing the things you were doing from a strategy standpoint, from a timeline standpoint. Keep doing full speed ahead.
So I think on this one, I'm going to speak to acquisition strategy, because I think this is where all the decisions get made. And for those of you who are listening in, who are CEOs, presidents, vice presidents, the people who are writing the proposals, this is one of the biggest things that's really hit my clients, which is really speaking about, is this a beneficial and strategic strategy to go ahead and get this certification, even if you are a non-prioritized acquisition? So some of the interesting things that are happening, number one, I'm going to speak to some new acquisition strategies that are being deployed. We started seeing them last year with GSA, where there's a scoring-based strategy now for contracts. So when you go to bid the proposals, one of the ones I did last year was GSA Astro. And GSA Astro, it pulled everything over from SAM, so you weren't writing these hefty management sections. And then it just asked you very simple questions like, do you have an approved accounting system? Check. You uploaded your document to prove it, and you got points. Well, the other thing you got points for was certifications for cybersecurity. So right now, because that's not CMMC, it was giving you points for things like ISO 27001. But in the future, we're going to see CMMC added to hey, you get 500 points just for having this cert. And you had to reach a baseline scoring threshold in order to even bid the pools, the individual pools in the different technical areas. And you couldn't even upload your past performance till you met that 2,500 point threshold. So having the cybersecurity certifications in hand are going to be a gateway mechanism that helps you get through that gate faster. Number two, the DoD incentives for certification come down are some of the things that Stacy Bosjanek from the director of CMMC policy was stating they're going to think about starting incorporating into contracts. So she said some of the things that we're looking at is the potential of, if a company can demonstrate that their networks are secure, if a company can demonstrate, how do you do that? Assessments. Then they could possibly garner a high profit margin. Now I'm going to replace that word garner with negotiate, because I think negotiate is more of an appropriate term when you're doing cost plus fixed fee contracts. How do you negotiate a higher fixed fee? You say, I have a CMMC cert, and that's worth more to you as the Department of Defense, federal government, GSA. I've already went and obtained this certification, and I feel that is worth a higher fee on this contract. Another area that they're looking at is increasing the use of evaluation criteria for contracts where it doesn't necessarily have to be a CMMC certification, because this is a near term until CMMC is in your contract sort of solution. She said, but we will assess people's network security as a part of source selection evaluation. So you have a choice, and they haven't presented yet how they're going to do this. My assumption is going to be a DIBCAC assessment, or they will bring in a C3PAO. I think it's more likely going to be a DIBCAC. And the question is will you have to be assessed every time you want to go win a contract as a part of the source selection evaluation? You get that certification, you won't have to go through that assessment every time. You've already third-party certified, and you're going to streamline right through the gate. So again, all this is building up to how do you win more contracts? You go ahead and get the cert now, while everybody's still muddling through, should we get it, should we not? You're on the kind of that thin bottleneck right now of getting in soon, bidding more, and winning more.
Fantastic insight. That's really important. Not just, it makes it real. How do we go get more business? How do you improve your positioning in terms of getting more business? I think it's important to point out also that these things are not overnight things as well. It takes time to get to a point where you can get to even, when the ecosystem's ready for you to take an audit, it's, you need to be ready to be able to go get that audit. It takes a while to be ready for those audits and deploy what you need to do. Christina, have you seen anything in terms of teaming strategies at all as well, in terms of how are contractors looking at their teaming partners relative through the prism of things like CMMC?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question too, because not only is this a gating mechanism for contracts themselves, but it's now going to become a gating mechanism for what CTAs you can participate in. The prime, when they're vetting you, they have two jobs here. They either have to determine, one, if you're going to receive CUI, do they need to verify that you've gotten some sort of third party, at least attestation of your score? Because we cannot trust always self attestations. And I think the primes are going to trust that less and less. So they're going to say, for this CTA, our client wants us, the federal government, the DoD wants us to assure them that every teammate that we have on this and every subcontractor, and they're even passing this down to vendors. So we're seeing these cybersecurity questionnaires being passed down even beyond a subcontractor level, and they're holding the vendors to it. So this is going through every avenue of the supply chain. And if you want to be on a team, this is how you differentiate yourself to get, if you're even looking to go from subcontractor to teammate, these are one of the avenues that I think can secure that position. In addition, I would also mention joint ventures. And I've talked to some clients that are forming new joint ventures where they're trying to figure out, okay, one of us has, a fully compliant infrastructure, the other one doesn't. Do they inherit our infrastructure? Those are really good questions. And yes, you can inherit one of the joint venture company's infrastructures. And Bill, you can probably speak to that as well as I can, how to build that and maintain that as a tenant in the Microsoft cloud, even if you're a subtenant to one of the parent organizations in the joint venture. So these are all tactics and strategies that you need to consider.
Absolutely. Great insight. Fantastic. Karen, what do we have next?
All right, next question. How does this change the documentation requirements?
Christina, I'm going to give that one back to you. This is just firmly in your wheelhouse.
So what we saw when they said, okay, we're taking out the 20 additional controls, it did allow us to not only reduce some of our policies and procedures by those 20 controls, it actually cut out 2 families that CMMC had created specifically for this package under CMMC. Now, what's really interesting about this too, as a side note, is I just saw a recent article where CMMC has said if they want to make changes to their inherent framework, they're actually going to run it through NIST in the future, and then actually have NIST make changes to the NIST 800-171 framework first. So in other words, CMMC has firmly asserted that NIST is taking the lead on designing the actual framework. They're going to inherit it and they're going to stop messing with it, is what it looks like they're saying. So from the policy and procedure side, so if you are looking at being a non-prioritized acquisition and you make widgets and the Department of Defense says that those aren't mission critical, those don't make things that go boom for the military, they don't make things that fly in the air, so we're less concerned about the parts you make, and you're not ITAR. At that point, what I want you to consider is getting that score posted. It may be bad at first. It may be negative, and that's okay. it's still a gateway threshold to get that done. And from the documentation standpoint, the only thing that's required from the self-attestation is the system security plan and the POAM. So you must have those done. And don't take lightly the system security plan. Hire a third-party services like BDO, my company, to help you construct that system security plan, so you know it's just going to be maintaining it from that point on. For those that are seeking certification, it is a little more complex. And while I recommend everybody to have policies and procedures, I understand that some companies who might have janitorial contracts or CETA work that doesn't involve CUI, they may say, well, I'm not going to write a whole bunch of policies and procedures. I'm just going to go to Bill. Bill's going to build out my infrastructure and I'm going to call it a day. And I say, that's fine. I'll send you to Bill. He'll cover you. But at the end of the day, if you're going for the certification, you need to have policies and procedures for all those families. And keep in mind, it's not just policies and procedures. Many of those families have other documents that you have to maintain. For a great example, awareness and training. How do you train your personnel for cybersecurity? You've got to have a program set up. You've got to have some form of a learning management system, even if you're only doing it manually in Excel. And you've got to have these various forms and things that kind of set up that program. So that's where it's good to have a company like BDO that comes in and helps you walk you through it. We give you all the templates, we help write it for you. And that way you're not crawling through the documentation trying to figure out what to write, or if you've answered the control securely enough. That's why we have cybersecurity experts on hand to help you through that.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add on to that is take the POAM seriously as well. It's there for a reason. It's there to identify where your weaknesses are. It's there to give you a roadmap on things you need to do next. Even if, whether you're at 20% or 80% or 90%, you've got a list of things to do, and that POAM should influence where you're going strategically, both on a big picture standpoint as well as smaller pieces of tactical things that you need to do. Do you need to move into a fully different cloud, or is it something, are you looking at things that are a little smaller, like rolling out a security training program? Different impact on what you're going to be doing moving forward with that. What do we got next? There we go.
Next question. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about GCC and GCC High. Do contractors still need to go to the GovCloud?
I think this one might be mine. So the answer is most likely yes. The requirements that were pushing folks to GCC and GCC High started with DFAR 7012, started with clauses C through G, and the requirements to be able to allow the government in and do essentially forensics in the event that you have a breach. Microsoft will only attest to clauses C through G in GCC and GCC High. So, that's kind of step one. That next step is if you have what they call CUI specified, and that's the stuff that requires data sovereignty, ITAR, nuclear, no foreign, something that requires both data residency and only access by US persons. Microsoft will only attest to that in GCC High. So these are all requirements that are beyond CMMC. They're separate from CMMC, but they will guide some pretty important strategic decisions in terms of which way you go with this. A lot of other vendors right now are putting together gov clouds, government versions of the clouds. That's those things, wherever they're available, always have a different level of capability. Usually that's the version that goes for a FedRAMP capability with most vendors. So if you're in this space, if you're going for these CMMC certifications, also look at the rest of your requirements and make those strategic decisions accordingly.
And Bill, can you also go into, I know we've worked many of our clients through you, and we've employed different strategies for when is it appropriate to have an enclave? When is it appropriate to just take their entire infrastructure into the cloud? Can you speak to that a little bit more too?
Yeah, absolutely. For us and the way we talk to our clients, there's no right or wrong answer on that. That answer runs across a spectrum. The example I always use is if you have 100 people in your company and there's a small group of 5 or 10 people that do DoD work, and they're the only people to do DoD work, maybe it makes sense to do an enclave because you can kind of separate those folks out and let them dedicate it and kind of take a little bit more of a baby step approach and make some decisions later whether you want to propagate that out through the rest of the organization. If you're an organization that's almost all DoD and it's 80, 95 people doing DoD work, well, then it's pretty straightforward. You should go all in and move the whole organization there. Where it gets tricky, though, is if you've got 5, 10, 15 people that are in DoD work, but you really need to pay attention to those folks that maybe don't work with DoD, but occasionally need access to it. Contracts admin people, executives, maybe some BD persons, maybe there's a really smart engineer you pull in from time to time on proposal work. You know, if you got to really look at that gray area, people who need occasional access to that DoD environment. And if that starts to get, out of hand, starts going into 20, 25, 30, 40% range, then that trade-off becomes a lot harder because the advantage of going to an enclave is you control your costs starting out. You have a little bit of a lower threshold to kind of get there and get installed, but your cost on doing an enclave is you're now literally running 2 separate IT environments. And those trade-offs start to shift a little bit when people need to live in both worlds. Now you've doubled up on your licensing costs, for example. You're still running literally 2 organizations from an IT standpoint. So it's really a spectrum in terms of where folks make that decision and which way they go with it.
Now, Bill, what about the companies that say, I've never seen CUI? We go through kind of the legacy CUI types, like for official use only and official use only in SBU, sensitive but unclassified. And we look, and they don't have any of those types either. But the government has put in a NIST 800-171 requirement into their contracts by hook or by crook. And so, I know one of the things that I've suggested to some clients is, well, we've got to meet this requirement until we get kind of that flow down from CMMC saying, oh, well, you don't really handle CUI, you don't have to do it. So I know one way I've kind of talked about with you is constructing just an enclave of one person, one environment into GCC or GCC High, and you make that person the CUI data manager, and then they're in charge of having the endpoint, receiving CUI, printing it out if it needs to be printed out, and making sure it's secured on both ends. Is that a good strategy? Have you seen a lot of clients be any successful with that when they don't have any CUI flowing in?
So generally when I get that question, I send them right back to you because you know this so much better than I do. And one of the things I love about what you do is you go through that whole exercise to prove whether or not they have CUI, and coming up, sometime soon, we'll do a whole session to let you run through your 11 points to go through that, because it's one of the better presentations I've ever seen on that. Assuming we get through that whole conversation and we're at that point, a data enclave of 1 is certainly fine. Whether it's 1 or 3 or 5 or 10 people, I think the important part is you have a space to hold the data, you have the controls in place, you've got the technologies deployed to make it work. So when if you have the opportunity or you do come into contact with that content, you have a place to store it and to process it and to work with it. And then as your contracts grow, or as those relationships grow, I think that also comes back to teaming partners. If a teaming partner says, I will let you in on this team, but only if you've got CMMC. You've got it sitting on the shelf. You can dust it off, fire up that, add a couple more people to it, everything else is in place. You're just adding more people. So if in those cases, that's not the worst strategy in the world, because you've started down the path, you've got things in place.
Well, and that's usually where I'm going when I recommend this, because what it allows you to do is to answer the NIST 800-171 controls, because they are trying to tell you, hey, you might not be receiving CUI right now, but the government's putting this in your contract because at some point down the road, you may receive it, and we need to make sure you have an environment that can house it. So I've told my clients who don't yet receive it and still want to continue operating out of Microsoft Commercial to say, okay, we'll keep that side. Let's just make sure it's secured to the FCI level or the CMMC ML1. And then we'll work on building this enclave of 1 for now, but it builds out the entire environment for CMMC level 2 and what's in your contract now, the DFAR 7012 clause, and it meets both, and it prepares you to receive CUI. And then one of the strategies we do is we put a little disclaimer on the bottom of your emails that are in the FCI side saying this email is not approved for the processing of CUI. And so that allows us to have this segregated environment. We store everything in there. And then when you win that contract where you're going to have 20 personnel, you go back to Bill and you say, Bill, I need 20 more licenses. but the environment's already built. You've already constructed it. You've already written the policies and the system security plan for it. So all the hard work is done. It can grow or shrink as you need to, and that's one of the benefits of Microsoft.
And that's I absolutely want to emphasize the speed that comes with that. Again, I've talked about it a little earlier. You can take 3, 6, 9 months to get to a point where you can confidently say I'm CMMC compliant, depending on what that lift is. If someone comes to you and says, I want you to bid on a contract it's going out on the street tomorrow, you don't have that time anymore. You can pivot and say, okay, I'm going to go after this. I can provision new users in there. I can transfer people over. I can accommodate and I can answer what the requirements are to do it. So for clients that aren't dealing with it every day, they want to hedge against that. They want to have the ability to really turn on a dime and be able to ramp up. It's not a bad strategy. We get a similar conversation sometimes. Folks will talk to us about holding CUI and not holding ITAR data, but they might, or they think they want to go for a contractor. They want to do that. So when we're talking about that enclave, take this, do a little bit extra work. It's a little bit harder to go to GCCI. No one's suggesting it isn't, but it gives you more ability, more flexibility, and hopefully more opportunity down the road.
Great, thanks guys. Let's talk a little bit about POAMs and exemptions. How do you foresee those working under 2.0?
I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, Christina. I'll let you run with it.
Okay, so POAMs, basically, because they're now allowing you to have open POAM items for the certification, as I said before, that's really good news. We touched on before how it's, they say they're gonna do a small subset of items that are gonna be held to like the highest risk categorization that you will not be able to have open in your POAM. That's totally understandable. And then the moderate to low, they're probably going to allow some, and they'll review it, and they'll review to see, what kind of vulnerability that induces in your system by leaving those items open. The other thing about POAMs, I will say from multiple years of DoD experience, DoD doesn't like any POAM item to go beyond a year. So usually what I tell my clients is, if you don't know when you're going to remediate this issue, make it for a year out from the current POAM date. And you can always change that as you go down the road, but never let it go over a year. Try to get it within 6 months to a year, because I think anything else, they're going to start asking questions like, why can't you close this out in a year? Sometimes we have legacy systems that we have to operate on, and those are cases where we may have open items and waiver issues because these systems are required to operate certain equipment, and the OEM has not updated the software yet, and so they're just not going to be compliant, and some never will be compliant. And so what we look to do from the cybersecurity perspective when we're pursuing a waiver, number one, if you've got those legacy systems you can't update, isolate them away from everything else in the network. Don't let anything touch them, because if they can't be patched, if they're end of life, you're going to have a lot of issues connecting those to your network. So isolate them, keep them separated. If you have to keep them running, keep anything that's coming in contact with those systems as isolated as possible. And that will help you justify something like a waiver. Like, we need this system to be waivered because, maybe the OEM just doesn't even exist anymore, but you still have to have this piece of equipment running. Seeing that all the time inside the DoD. I mean, we had systems that were 20, 30 years old. We were sitting there going, how is this system still running? And yet they needed it for one thing. I see that all the time inside of a lot of our clients. So keep in mind, the DoD will not just hand out waivers. You have to make a very good justification. Those are the type of things that I saw that rolled for the DoD in terms of justifications, which was, we have a legacy system, the OEM doesn't update software anymore, and this is how this piece of equipment has to run.
Yeah, a couple things that came out of, I think it was the first CMMC Accreditation Board town hall when CMMC 2.0 came out, is the DoD folks are on that conversation, talked about the fact that POAMs will be time bound. I think they threw out, it wasn't locked in, but 6 months was where they were thinking that, and to take it in the spirit of what it is of, hey, look, okay, you're not perfect, but you actually need to do the work. It's not like before CMMC where those POAMs were really on an infinite timeline. They are going to be time bound. There are going to be barriers around there. And they certainly indicated that exemptions are going to be hard to get. We're not going to hand those out like candy on Halloween. They're going to be, a couple layers and a couple sign-offs, and folks are going to have to sign off on those exemptions, which always kind of raises the stress level to get those things. So I think hopefully there'll be a really good tool for the cases that they're needed for. And like you said, so a lot of situations where stuff is just outdated and we can't get them where we want them to be.
All right, next question. Talk a little bit about the recently released CMMC scoping guidance.
So when I looked at it, it kind of seemed to mimic a lot of CMMC guidance. And I guess that's sort of a good thing. It does certainly follows 171A, which is the self-assessment documentation. So there's a lot of familiarity there for folks who've been doing this for a while. I kind of hope that they take another step at some point and start to give us some prescriptive guidance of things are, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, this is what we're looking for, this is what we're not looking for. If you're on any of the boards or chat boards or stuff, you can take pretty much any control in 171 and have an hour-long conversation or longer about what's going too far, what's enough, what is this really trying to say. And I'm really looking forward to us to start to get some measuring sticks on some of these controls to tell us, hey, this is good enough. This is what we meant from the intent of things.
Yeah, I think my take on it is it's a good start, but nowhere near where we need to be in terms of getting answers into the hands of the DIB contractors so that they can perform this scoping in a much clearer fashion. So one of the things you'll see in the links that we send out is I have some supplemental scoping guidance attained from a dear friend of mine, Tom Cornelius from Compliance Forge. He does a lot of kind of proactive, pro bono things for the community for CMMC and helping to understand and really wrap your arms around it. He's put out a really excellent scoping guide that I think is very clear and I think adds to the discussion of the scoping guides that were released. So it really allows us to have some defined authorization boundaries. And so that's a big part of what my team does. Bill, when you were kind of referring to our initial scoping, that's like step number one when we engage with a client is we go in and we have to scope the environment. And not only the environment, we're not just talking about the IT systems, we're talking about all of the business processes and how we integrate, how everybody does their job, how all those units interact. And those include things like personnel security and physical and environmental security and awareness and training and all the things that kind of outside of the IT infrastructure, but really build into that program comprehensively. So we have to know first and foremost, what is the size of the environment we're scoping to? And we look at use cases, how many users actually touch CUI, how many are sending it, receiving it, storing it, where are they storing it? Because all of those things have to have an attributable security control that locks that data in securely and makes sure that we don't have any data exfiltration or data loss. So that's where Bill will come on board. He'll implement data loss prevention services within the Microsoft ecosystem, help us metadata tag that data. And then, again, the point is we're drawing an invisible boundary around every asset and personnel that touch CUI to give us a really clear picture of is this going through every part of the organization? Are we looking at the entire enterprise needing to be compliant? Or are we looking at only a piece of it? And that might be a piece that's performing under a specific DoD contract. That might just be 2 personnel that handle some level of CUI documentation, and really they're the only ones who touch it. So then we start to question, how can we segregate that such that we hold, a majority of the enterprise network as much as we can to the 17 controls of the level 1, while holding just this small footprint that's touching CUI within this authorization boundary that we might deem a CUI enclave. We might just stick it in a solution that safeguards that data within a file sharing solution, the Microsoft solution. And this helps us determine how to scope. And so it was really critical to receive these scoping guides because the DoD did specify you know, just how much is out of scope, which is really critical. And especially when it calls out things like operational technology for the manufacturers and how they deem that out of scope. That is a critical discussion I've had with a lot of my manufacturing clients, is how much of your OT is in scope. And that made us draw bigger authorization boundaries than we necessarily needed to do. So these scoping guides are critical. Review them, meet with a cybersecurity expert that can help you design those authorization boundaries and the CUI FCI data flow.
Yeah, I was really happy when you recommended putting Tom's link in there. That's a great guide, and one of the things I get the most out of it is it helps you put your thoughts together around what's directly involved, but also some of the stuff that's indirectly involved, and it makes you think a little bit about where, okay, well, these systems do interact, and there is data flow. That's kind of in the boundary as well.
Right.
I think the other thing it's worth pointing out too is the scoping guidance very clearly put the spotlight back on folks like ourselves as service providers, and very clearly talked about how we are going to be within the boundaries, within the scope in a lot of these conversations. I think that's healthy for the industry, for the ecosystem. We need to, as managed service providers, we need to be part of that as well. We need to accept our role and where we fit in that system boundary, and in a lot of cases we're going to wind up being inside it, and we need to also attest. So I thought that was good. I hope to see more guidance in that space as they move forward with it, to give folks like ourselves, again, better clarity on where we need to be as we go through. So Karen, what's next?
All right, we've got polling question number 3, our last one.
All right.
The question is, how has CMMC 2.0 affected your compliance strategy? Has it accelerated it, left it about the same, slowed it down, extended your timeline, put everything on hold, or too soon to tell? All right, there we are. So most looks like about the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to see over half are at the same or accelerating. That's really encouraging news. I think that's a really positive impact. That at least to me tells me that folks are hearing that message, that stay on schedule, all the things that we've talked about earlier, and it's really exciting to see some folks that are accelerating it. I think one thing that's come out of this for some of our clients is that folks that were a little bit on hold, now that they have that clarity and they know that CMMC is not going away, because there were still some folks holding out on that, hope of that, we've started to see some folks that are on hold starting to move forward now. So that's pretty good. Christina, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I really think this is very representative for a lot of my clients, that some are accelerating their schedule because they want to get through that certification benchmark as soon as possible before the glug of the 300,000 DIB contractors are trying to do it. Some are just holding to the timeline they have because they know they've got time with CMMC 2.0 coming out. They know it's going to be about 24 months to really firmly situate this into the federal government space. So we know we've got about a 24-month time frame once they introduce Model 2.0. Some are slowing down because of this. They're saying, hey, we don't have to be certified tomorrow, so let's implement this, let's do it right, but let's also do it on our time schedule and within the funding that we have to execute. And I think all of these answers are perfectly acceptable, because it all comes down to, what is your business risk strategy?
Absolutely.
All right, let's see here. We've got two formal questions left. The second to the last one is, what's the incentive to become compliant now?
And so I'll kind of head that up, because we mentioned the contract incentives that are starting to appear. And some of these contract incentives that we discussed before about potentially garnering a higher, or I say negotiating a higher profit margin, or being able to get certified so you don't have to go through a contract evaluation every time a source selection is made. This is more about differentiators and streamlining your acquisition process. And then that third thing about maybe pocketing a little more profit really isn't a bad idea either. I worked for a defense contractor small woman-owned defense contractor for 22 years prior to coming to BDO. So I know those pain points. I know when you're negotiating for that fee, even a 0.5% makes so much difference in the pocket of a contractor. So the small businesses that I've been talking to, they said this is going to make all the difference for us, because yes, we're looking at, it's between, by the time you go through like all the consulting that we provide, all the technology solutions, you know, you may be over 100K investment in that, but it will be that gateway mechanism to win you more contracts, to garner more profit. And I think from a strategy of getting the compliance now, it means you're getting to be one of the first companies through that door, getting that certification, holding it for 3 years. And you know, for 3 years, you're going to have these award points. You're going to have potentially a higher profit negotiation. And that's just value back to the contractor.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about this part is it DoD has given more than just lip service to it. We're actually seeing some of the ideas come out. They're actually talking about some of the things they want to do. That to me is almost setting some expectations in the industry that they're going to have to do something now, because they've put some tangible items out there to get kind of reaction and from it. And then kind of going back to what you said, not only is there a cost, but there's also time involved in becoming compliant now. So if takes 3, 6, 9 months to get to a point where you're compliant, and 6 months from now they come out with, you know, this ability to get a little more margin or this scoring capability, you're ready and in a timely manner, as opposed to being flat-footed and caught off guard and maybe being at a disadvantage in some cases, you know, a little further down the pike.
And I will mention one last thing about a strategy for becoming compliant now. By going and getting the third-party certification, it's kind of like hiring a CPA to do your end-of-year taxes, right? If something goes wrong, they're the ones calculating it. They're the ones that appear for you in court, because they're the ones that ultimately gave you your score. And so by getting that third-party certification, I had somebody say, this is the Washington Post test. It's like, we've already done our due diligence. We can prove it. A third party said we were performing our due diligence enough to give us a certification. So if any breach happened past that point, you've already got this like hard ticket of certification. I've done my due diligence. I already proved it to you. The fact is, you know, we can only stay ahead as much as we can for threats, especially like zero-day threats that are coming out. So, you know, this is the concern for us, is to make sure you have a company that's representing you, like a third-party certifying agency that can give you that certificate.
And you know, talking about a little bit of those things that help you as well. Anyone who is looking at cyber insurance in any way, shape, or form right now, they're probably getting some sort of risk score. They're getting a lot of questionnaires. We've seen some questionnaires from cyber insurance firms that are harder than NIST 171. So that is very much coming around, and it's coming. You know, it's going to be there very soon. We get emails every once in a while from clients that are like, "Hey, am I good? Because I got this cyber insurance questionnaire that is, you know, pretty onerous and pretty challenging, even when you measure it up to 171. So just one more incentive to go towards it.
And Bill, are you seeing any discounts for cyber insurance if you get this certification?
We
Have they
haven't
even
seen
been
any
discussing that?
discount. I think it puts you in a better risk profile, which will probably lower your premium, but that's certainly not our area of expertise. What we do is work with our clients, help give them the, you know, obviously, where are you today? And by the way, these other 4, 5, 6 questions, here's how we go address them and change your risk score.
Right.
All right, so we are at about 2 o'clock. We have one last question as part of the presentation, and then we do have a handful of questions from our audience. So hoping that everyone can stick around for a few more minutes. Let's get this one out. What are the contractual risks to not working towards compliance?
So I think this one, you know, we just talked about some of the carrots to get there. The stick that's out there is the new DOJ cyber fraud initiative. The Department of Justice came out and said that that they are going to start to pursue contractors that do not report a breach, that are not necessarily representing themselves, that And that includes, looking at my notes here, pursuing companies that knowingly misrepresent cyber practices, quote unquote, on there. And they're going to use the False Claims Act as a vehicle to go after contractors when they go in and they, for whatever reason, it becomes revealed they aren't necessarily doing what they're representing that they're doing. From what I understand, that's more than just a press conference. They're putting real personnel in on that initiative and going to actually staff that office and go after it.
Right. And I've also seen the Navy penalize contractors who were not cyber compliant when they had the DFARS clause that they signed in their contract, which states you must be compliant, and the deadline that's still hard coded in the DFARS clause is December 31st, 2017. So, they hard coded that in there. And I think when you sign that in your contract, you are attesting that you are compliant. The Navy, one of the things I've seen them do is they remove the award fee for all the years of the contract. So I've seen some harsh penalties for this because that basically means you're performing the contract at no profit. But I don't think anybody wants to do that. So I think they're trying to work out what those penalties are with these new cyber fraud initiatives combined with the False Claims Act. They are coming down hard on any company that knowingly misrepresented. Now, how they're going to prove you knowingly or unknowingly misrepresented, if you had a score that wasn't calculated correctly, I think they will get to the heart of that, but you definitely don't want to be in a court case with the federal government on that.
Not at all. Not at all. All right, Karen, I think we have a couple of questions. I know we're a little bit over the hour, but it looks like
Yep.
We can probably stay a couple more minutes and try to address them.
Yep, that sounds good. I'm going to read the questions off so everyone can hear them. You guys have them in front of you. A couple of are a little complex, so good thing that you have the written one as well. So the first one, if you are only interested in CMMC level 1, there are only 17 controls. Do you have to do the whole self-assessment on the 110 requirements of NIST 800-171? Or can you just do the self-assessment on the 17 requirements for level 1 and upload that assessment to SPRS?
So a lot of this comes down to your scoping. So part of what we do in the scope is we gather your contractual requirements. And I will state that sometimes you might have a federal contract. And one of the interesting things is if you're seeing DFARS 7012 in your Department of Defense contracts, you have to manage the full NIST 800-171. They don't have any internal scoping to downscope it to this CMMC level 1 because we don't have CMMC in your contracts yet. So if you see NIST 800-171 in your contracts, you are obligated for that unless you can negotiate with your contract authority to pull that out of your contract. And that's usually the first step I take with my clients. If they have no CUI flowing through their systems, the first step we say is, hey, we don't have any CUI flowing through the systems. Can you remove this from my contract? The other thing is if you have a COTS exemption, definitely tell the program officer to remove that from your contract, because if you only make a COTS item and they don't consider that sensitive to the DoD, then by all means push that as hard as you can. So that's the only way I can see you can downscope down to the FAR clause level, since CMMC is not in the contracts yet. But the other thing you need to note is that you can't just pick and choose. You've got to go by what's in your contracts. You've got to scope your environment to that. It will cover both the FCI and the CUI that will fall in scope under the NIST 800-171. I think I had another point, but it's totally jumped out of my mind. Bill?
No, that's well said. You're definitely the expert on those items, and it's good insight there.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Next question. How do I know if my company is a prioritized or non-prioritized acquisition?
So how the DoD has stated this is that they will tell you. They're going to tell you in the solicitation or the RFI, and you'll probably see it in the RFP as well. And since CMMC is not in your contracts yet, right now that has to be identified by your contract authority. So if you don't have a designated contract officer, you need to be getting answers from someone. The other thing that I will link onto this is if you have CUI processing through your environment, you need to request, if this is a DoD contract, SCG or a system classification guide. They're supposed to give you one to tell you how to process and label the CUI. If they can't give you an SCG, I would ask for either an informal email that tells you what CUI they anticipate, or BDO, we have a form that I've drawn up that you send to your contract authority so that you can request further information, because you need to know if it's CUI basic, if it's CUI specified, because as Bill said before, when we get into CUI specified, that goes down a whole nother path because we might be dealing with data sovereignty requirements. So these are answers you have to ask, not only on the front end when you're trying to determine if you're a prioritized or non-prioritized, but if you receive CUI.
Yeah, Christina, I don't know if you've heard anything. One of the things I've struggled with is that going to be driven by the sensitivity of the data, or the amount of people or amount of auditors that can pass through and get people through the accreditation process as well? Because there's kind of, you could look at that either way. You made a reference things that go boom earlier. Certainly those prioritized, you would think. But if there's not enough people to push companies through the accreditation process, I looked at that as a convenient throttling mechanism as well. We're only we'll start prioritizing more as we have more companies get through the system.
And I will say this, as I'm a contractor who's worked for the programs that go boom. I won't name which ones, but I spent 22 years working as a tactical communications engineer for the things that go boom. And I will say, those of you who make software, hardware for our missile defense systems, you're going to be a prioritized acquisition. You can almost bet your money on it. So if you make things that we don't want to get to be exfiltrated to China, pretty much assume you're going to be a prioritized acquisition. Those of you, if you're saying, I don't know if I'm a non-prioritized, I just have this janitorial services, and yes, we work in a classified lab, but we're just doing janitorial services, I think you're a good case to go back to your contract officer and go, listen, this contract is, I have janitorial staff. We don't have any CUI flowing through our systems.
Yeah, I think another great example is those staff log organizations, those companies that 80–90% of the organizations sit on a government site, work on GFE all the time, and really hold almost no data internally. Those have always been a challenge. And I think even some of them will probably even try to make arguments that they're level 1, but even when they take that level 3 challenge, they're perfect candidates for self-assessments as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, next question. Regarding POAM exceptions, in a remote workplace environment, has any consideration been taken towards split tunneling?
So unfortunately, no, the requirements are still hard-coded into the NIST framework, where they say split tunneling is a no-no. I hope that changes, because what we do recognize, and I've told this to all of my clients, that we would have considered prior to the pandemic working from home part of your contingency operations, and now it's our norm. So I think we are much more sophisticated in how we set up those contractors that are working from home. I know Bill's had a lot of experience and can speak to this. I know one thing I will say before I turn it over to Bill to talk a little bit more about this is that when we start setting up those endpoint devices, I know that we like to put an additional software VPN on the endpoint, especially when we know they're connecting from a home environment. We just assume any Wi-Fi device they're connecting from or router device is insecure. So making that presumption, we try to encrypt as much of the traffic going out from the endpoint as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's just the end answer there is the data needs to be encrypted in transit, full stop. How you're doing that, what the mechanism and to do that, that's you kind of work that through on a client by client, or whatever the requirements are for that individual organization.
Great, thanks. Okay, next question. Does CMMC make a differentiation between a data processor and a data controller similar to GDPR?
I'm not really sure how to answer that one, Bill.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, other than the fact that GDPR obviously is much more privacy focused, and GDPR, while there's good overlap with CMMC type stuff, GDPR goes a lot goes into a different area and a different neighborhood with how you control that data. What do you do with it? What are you allowed to do with it? Whereas CMMC is mostly focused with securing the data. So not a personal expert on GDPR, other than the fact that I don't think there is a differentiation in CMMC. It's the measuring sticks are: do you store that data? Do you transit? Do you process it? Is it under your control? That's really what the guidelines are to come out of both NIST and 7012 and CMMC.
Okay, great. Thanks. One more question. Well, actually, two more questions. Since the cybersecurity problem arose out of trusting vendors doing self-certification, how do you think the new level 1 self-certification is going to improve the existing problem?
I don't think level 1's going to improve the problem. I think the concern I have is the level 2 used to be level 3 self-certification. That's my biggest concern, is that I get that we're differentiating between the mission critical and the non-mission critical, prioritized and the non-prioritized. And we're just saying, okay, if you're non-prioritized, we're not as concerned about what you're doing because you may not even be receiving CUI data. But I think self-certification is problematic in all areas, no matter what level we're talking about, because I've seen the majority of the contractors that we've worked with really not have the depth of understanding they need for how to completely implement the control. And with controls, I always say it's binary. You have fully implemented every sub-level part of the control, or it's not implemented. Partially implemented to me means zero. You're not implemented. So for me, the biggest problem is that a lot of people, when they self-score on partial answers.
Sure. I think self-assessments on level 1 made sense. We don't have auditors. We don't have the ecosystem up and running. We can knock out whatever the number is, well over half, probably over 3/4 of the contractors. Let them kind of do their own thing from that, because they're not holding CUI data. But we also have that little bit of a hook there on the back end that the corporate officer does need to sign that attestation. So when you couple that with someone misrepresenting it, there's a little more of a safety net there. But I absolutely agree with you. The concern is those folks that are holding CUI, that have that higher level of requirement, and are they going to do what they need to do? Again, those same things are in place. The DOJ is in place. Those other pieces are in place. I hope that leads to a better answer. And I do think that goes back to the prioritized acquisitions. That's a way to throttle this and decide how many you should or shouldn't be. If they start seeing really good results, it becomes a little easier to do so. If the problem doesn't go away, it becomes a lot easier for everything to be prioritized.
Okay, and I know that you all have probably gotten this question before. Can you give us a rough estimate on the cost for a small business DoD contractor to reach CMMC level 3?
So I think this is why this is such a big win for small contractors. When we talk about the technology for any firm, and especially cloud-based firms today, that cost is scalable. We can get it into a dollars per user per year type of model that expands as the company expands. And as the company just go down in size, to some extent also kind of reduce that to at least in a relative way. I think the real challenge is that the documentation, you're still meeting all of those 110 controls regardless of your size. It was hard to scale that differently. So for us, our answer is going to be on the technology side of the equation. That number is going to shift depending on how small you really are. 2 or 3 people versus 20 versus 200 is proportionally going to be bigger because the technology scales accordingly. The other piece that factors into that is what type of firm are you? Are you a professional services firm where you just basically have an instance of Microsoft 365 and you sit in the cloud and maybe some endpoint devices? That's one profile. If you're a manufacturer that's if you're doing 3D printing and you've got 30 people, but you've got a really complex environment and maybe doing a lot of analysis up in Azure or something like that, that cost is going to be dramatically different. So that's one of the reasons it's hard to give a number, even at this point, with a little bit of an easier threshold to get there.
And I think from my side, typically what we do is we interact in building the information assurance program. So information assurance is one of two arms of cybersecurity. And I always like to differentiate what we do as opposed to what infrastructure does and what Bill does. So, I always talk about it as like Bill's the guy with the hands on his keyboard. That's, kind of active cyber defense. And then information assurance writes and documents and tracks the program itself on paper. So what it does is it takes your security requirements and then aligns how you're meeting them in that level of documentation and helps you not only plan proactively, but we go back and we interact with the implementation side to make sure that, Bill and I are speaking the same language, that we've incorporated the business operations. And so from my perspective, I'm going to speak, take Bill's and put it to the side because it's going to grow or shrink depending on that scoping that we talked about, your authorization boundaries and how many personnel and how many pieces of equipment that grows or shrinks. And luckily with Microsoft, it can grow or shrink easily. But my side, I typically tell contractors, depending on how much you have in terms of internal team, resources to help you build the documentation. Ours takes anywhere from 80,000 to 150,000 for most companies. And that is just the God's honest truth, because what we do is over the course of a year, we teach you how to put each element of the cybersecurity program into place. So from that point on, it's yearly management, and we're basically guiding you through all of that. So if you consider the cost differential to hire a cybersecurity SME like myself would cost you starting at 150 grand per year. So, when you go to these companies that can advise on this, you're getting kind of this program put down in place into a year with a team of professionals that write everything for you, help you build that program, and then teach you how to manage that rolling forward.
Okay. I think we are at about the end here, 2:21. So we've gone just a little bit over, but everyone seems to have hung around. So great information. For those that did have to drop off, as I said before, we'll send out an email to all of the participants with the recorded conversation, and then also that list of documents that both Christina and Bill referenced that will be helpful as well. And finally, if you have any more specific questions to either of our panelists, I've included their contact information here. Bill, Christina, any last words?
No, just thank you for joining us. We're sorry to kind of go over a little bit here. I can be quite verbose. I apologize, but I'm always passionate about making sure that everybody is armed with the kind of information they need to make the right decisions for their organization moving forward. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and I want to thank Christina. Thank you for joining us on this and being a partner in this, being a great partner for us in what we do. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around a little long. I hope this was valuable information. And if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to one of us, and we'll do everything we can to help you out.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.